closing slide that Gary showed, FEMA has defined a number of hazards in this country to be catastrophic. And for that reason, there's extra initiatives that are going on to address those particular hazards. New Madrid is one of those. And the graphic that Gary showed with the crossroads of all the infrastructure that come through here make it truly a national problem, not just something that we face here in Memphis-Shelby County. My organization, the Central U.S. Earthquake Consortium, represents 8 states, essentially those states that would be impacted by a New Madrid event. And it's for that reason that we take planning very seriously. We take these initiatives to make every effort we can to raise the awareness of the things we need to be doing to reduce that vulnerability so that hopefully catastrophic is not as catastrophic as we think it could be. So we're going to shift gears and we'll talk a bit about the actual issues at hand, if you will, some of the code issues related to building resiliency. Our panel today is made up of a panel of engineers, building officials, and builders representing various cross-sections of the community. Excuse me. Our moderator for today is Bob Jacobson, former building official for Bartlett area, which is a suburb of Memphis, and is currently with the Code Solutions Incorporated. So, Bob, before I lose my voice.
Thank you, Jim. First thing we need to do is ask the panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start on the far right down there and work our way back this way, please.
Are we on?
Can you hear me? I got this on. There you go. Okay. My name is John Rush. I'm with the West Tennessee Home Builders Association representing them. I am a custom home builder in the area.
My name is Julie Furr. I'm a structural engineer representing the West Tennessee Structural Engineers Association.
Hello, I'm David Johnston from New Zealand. I'm at Massey University in GNS Science and I study disaster management.
My name is Jim Harris. I'm a structural engineer from Denver, Colorado. I'm here because I've participated in a study of costs and benefits with regard to seismic provisions and building codes centered here in Memphis.
Hi, I'm Jay Stressel with Memphis Light, Gas, and Water, also a structural engineer. I'm over facilities, building new buildings and existing buildings, and I'm here to talk about the utility system and our building systems in general.
Can everyone hear the panelists okay? We may want to just handhold those, I don't know.
1, 2.
Now we can pass them around.
Try again, Jay.
I'm with the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. I'm a project manager and I do earthquake outreach to promote awareness of earthquakes in here. Good afternoon.
That's not on.
Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Harrison. I'm a project manager with the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes and I do earthquake outreach and awareness.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Remington Brown. I'm with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and I'm a senior engineering manager. I'm here to talk a little bit about our Fortified for Safer Living program and residential construction, some of the experiences we've had with that.
Panelists, if you will, when we use the microphones, try to get them pretty close to your mouth. We'll move through a list of questions that were provided by CUSAC. Each one is kind of directed at different members of the panel. One of them was directed to a building official, and since I'm the only building official, I'll kick this off by answering it. As a former building official, what challenges or resistance did you see to adopting new codes? And were there fears grounded in valid construction concerns or cost consideration? Well, obviously cost is always a big factor in construction. Constructability, being able to build a building, is very important too. So the codes have got to work with both of those. In my mind, the biggest factor in changing the codes is the learning curve. As a young inspector, I bet I heard 3 times a day, I've been doing this 42 years and I'm not changing anything. This is the way I do it. There's nothing wrong with it. And the other one was, boy, you got to quit reading that book. So the The real concern there, of course, is human nature resisting change. We all resist change one way or the other. If we give into it, we'll still be living in log cabins or even worse, caves. So we got to have change. The industry changes whether we like it or not. We're building some high-tech homes out there today and commercial buildings with indoor plumbing, electric lights, comfort heating and cooling, Wi-Fi, surround sound, whole house integration. All this is change, and it was accepted. In the process of all this change, we've learned that we need to make our exits adequate so we can get out. Fresh air, energy conservation, fire resistance, insect protection, rot and decay protection, seismic, obviously, seismic resistance is important, high winds, don't build in flood-prone areas, snow loading, and many more. Now, I've opened that door if anybody would like to jump in on that, or we'll move on to the next question. Panelists? All right. We'll start out with Rem Brown. What is Fortified for Safer Living? Why is it important to IBHS?
Thanks, Bob. Y'all hear me okay? Okay, so IBHS is an acronym for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. I know that doesn't quite line up, but IBHS has been around longer than the actual name, so we're taking advantage of that. And we're an independent, nonprofit, scientific and educational organization that's wholly supported by the property insurance industry. So our mission is to conduct objective scientific research that identifies and promotes effective actions that strengthen homes, businesses, and communities against natural disasters and other causes of loss. Now, one of the ways that we push the research out into the design and building community is through our Fortified programs. And Fortified for Safer Living is a voluntary new home construction program with structural requirements that go beyond the current codes. The program standards are designed to increase a home's resistance to whatever the natural hazards are that threaten the area where that home is located.
Anybody have any comments you want to add to that? Okay, Julie Furr? Why should homeowners, business owners care about earthquake risk in building codes?
Well, I think Dr. Berryman probably answered that better than I could. Building codes are designed to are intended for a life safety use. They're not necessarily intended for immediate occupancy or shelter in place or use after the event. As we saw in Christchurch, there were several buildings that did come down, but one of their key factors to their resiliency was the ability to shelter in place. And that's one of the things that with the building codes, we try to focus on the life safety, let people get out of the buildings, but we haven't focused so much on shelter in place and the resiliency of those buildings after the fact.
Thank you. Our builder, John Ruch. The question of sustainability, recycling, and energy conservation in new homes is a hot topic these days. Can you tell us how industry is changing in these areas and is sustaining an earthquake part of the strategy?
Thank you. When it comes to building a home and you think about where you're going to live and the cost and the ongoing cost, not just the initial cost of building, but just the cost of ownership, energy efficiency and sustainability are a very large part of that equation, often overlooked, and right or wrong, houses that are typically built to code is built to a lower standard, if I can use that kind of thought. What I try to do, what I look for when building a home is trying to build it to a higher standard, whether that be a ResNet or Energy Star, EcoBuild would be an MLG&W program. When it comes to seismic, obviously, number one thing is safety of somebody living in the home I built. And second to that, although less, is obviously the affordability of it. So in that, and then getting people to buy my product, which I only do custom homes, I don't do spec homes, is when I lay that out and explain to them what they're getting and that the standard is higher than what you may get somewhere else. I would say 99% of the people are interested in that, and ultimately we'll go that route.
Thank you.
Bob, if I could add to that,
Yeah,
I think
jump in,
that
Julie.
that's actually touched on one of the fundamental arguments between adopting building codes or not adopting building codes and the seismic risk. Again, we haven't had a large event since 1811, 1812 with, that has increased the public awareness. So when someone goes to build a home from a custom home builder, they do have the opportunity to sit down with the home owners and explain the benefit of the seismic upgrades. But with the standard spec homes, anybody goes out to purchase a home, oftentimes you don't even know who the builder is. You don't get the opportunity to sit down with that builder and understand why this house cost more than the house next door and why it benefits you to purchase that home. So that's part of the public awareness that I think we all need to work on, engineers, public officials, and builders, just in letting the public understand that difference.
I see Barbara agreeing. Are you wanting to jump in on that too?
I really think that we need to do a better job of educating people on the importance of increasing this culture of prevention. I mean, people have to understand, you can't predict your seismic risk. You never know when an earthquake is going to happen. And we know from recent events, the unthinkable does happen. It happened in Christchurch. It happened in the U.S. during Superstorm Sandy. So we've got to do a better job of understanding how our homes are built, to what code they're built, and to understand that there are things that we can do even after it's built to strengthen that home and be better prepared.
Thank you. Keep the microphone. We'll go ahead and throw a question at you while you got it.
Okay.
Do you think seismic residential codes are important to an average homeowner? If so, why?
I think that if they understood their risk, they would be very important to them. And if they understood how the building codes are developed and how that the USGS develops these risks specific to the particular area, we're not expected to build in Tennessee to California standards. It wouldn't be appropriate. The risks for this, the building codes for this area were designed for the risk in this area. So we know that properly adopted and enforced building codes are the cornerstone of resilient communities. And in Memphis and Shelby County, we know that over 90% of the buildings in this area are residential. So that just reinforces the importance of having strong residential codes. And so we do it at Flash through strong, powerful, positive messaging. And we want consumers to understand their risk, and then we give them some tools to help them take incremental steps to increase their safety, as I referred to earlier. We have resources on our website at it's www.flash.org. Flashcards that can help you take steps to mitigate not just your home structure, but there are things within your home that you can secure. People can be hurt by falling items in their homes, so they need to take steps to protect against those during earthquake.
If I may add something real quickly. From the home building standpoint, obviously, there is a finite amount of money that's available to build any structure. And that is totally out of the hands of the builder, and oftentimes out of the hands of the homeowner to be. We are subject to what an appraiser will allow and what a bank will then accept in relation to an appraiser. So when you have that finite amount of money and you are trying to build a satisfactory home to whatever the standard may be, that is a realistic wall that everyone faces. And so that's the practical impact of then what do I do from a homeowner standpoint. Now again, I build custom homes, which is a little bit different, as Julie pointed out. However, I have built homes before to a higher standard using geothermal and things of that nature, to come back to find out that the appraiser will not approve it because it had the same energy efficiency as the house built in 1950. Well, no, it doesn't, but we're up against that. And so there's a struggle from that side to take what we know is right and never sacrifice safety and explain to the homeowner the availabilities and then getting the bank to finance it. And over 50% of people for whom I build self-finance because they can't get the banks or the appraisers to see the value.
Anyone else? I know from my perspective as an inspector for all the years, we had a builder leave the sheetrock off of certain areas of his house, even though the house was finished and for sale. And he put plexiglass up, and you could look through the plexiglass and you could see the things he added to a house that weren't required. He exceeded the minimums by a tremendous amount. Right down the street was the same floor plan, and people were buying those because his was $15,000 higher. And they were saying, well, it's the same floor plan. Well, in an earthquake, the one that when he finally sold it and took the plexiglass off and put up the sheetrock and finished it, it would probably stand up good in an earthquake, whereas the ones down the street probably did not or would not. Fortunately, we hadn't had that quake yet. David Johnston, as you toured around Memphis area, what similarities do you see between Memphis and Christchurch as far as building stock, city layout, public resource availability?
We've only had a very short visit here. We came in last night, but I think some of the images and the handouts that were given and the slides that Kelvin showed really does highlight many of the similarities. The single-story dwellings, the communities are very similar, and the geography and the geomorphology is very similar. So I think that there is much I think we can share from the New Zealand experience that would assist some of the thinking around your earthquake safety here. So there is much in common. And our dinner last night was far superior to some of the food we have back home.
Jim Harris, what were the expectations of developing the ATC 89, and did this study focus only on differing seismic requirements or on all differing structural requirements between the code revisions?
The primary focus was what does seismic code provisions cost, and centered specifically here in Memphis. There have been studies in the past, some of which were also centered in Memphis. I participated in one 1981 through 1983, looking at the impact of some very newly developed seismic provisions that were intended to be applicable nationwide and what kind of impact they would have. We studied, I think, 9 different cities. Memphis was one of them. There were many objectives in that study. One of them was what the cost of construction would be. One of them was what the cost impacts on design and building regulation would be. One of them was, well, do these provisions make sense? Are engineers who are picking these new provisions up getting reasonable answers out of them? Are they getting confused? And this study, the ATC 89 study, which was funded by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, had one fundamental objective: is what's the cost premium? What really is it? Try to weed out the extraneous things that came into the study 30 years ago, and there was another study 20 years ago which had a very limited scope, just looking at certain kinds of cast-in-place concrete buildings. What is the cost? And then, as a secondary objective, study what the benefits in building performance would be, what they might be. We don't have nearly as good of a tool to do that second objective as the first one. And I think the answers are interesting. What we did was we gathered a group of engineers, architects, building official, developers, and contractors together here in Memphis to decide what kinds of buildings ought to be studied within certain parameters. And we picked 6 buildings: a 3-story wood-framed apartment building, a 6-story steel-framed hospital, a 4-story steel-framed office building, a typical big box retail store with heavy walls, a really large distribution warehouse, which Memphis has a heck of a lot of, and lastly a school, an elementary school. And what we found, then we designed each one of these things 3 times, once as if there were no seismic requirements in Memphis. Move yourself 400 miles some direction and say that the only lateral force you need to worry about is wind. Make the building conform to the current codes for wind. Second one was make the building conform to the current code for seismic in Memphis. And the third one was make the building conform to what the new seismic code in Memphis is going to be. and find out what the cost differences were. We had one estimator estimate all 18 of these designs then and find out what the differences were. And it's mostly academic, I think, since you're already designing for a certain level of seismic here. But what we found to go from a wind-only design to what you're going to be doing next year with the new code averaged 1.6% increase in construction cost. This doesn't include land and site development, but it does include the full building construction cost. It varied from 0.5% to 2.8%, depending upon which building type we were looking at. What's probably of more interest is what's it going to cost to go from where you've been for the last several years to where you will be in the future, and that's 0.6% on the average. And that varied from no change. And the no change was for the hospital, where your current code doesn't allow the exception for hospitals to be designed by what I'm going to call an old code, up to, I think it was 1% for the really big warehouse. And the weighted average that I computed was 0.6%. And so the fundamental numbers that come out of this study is, yes, seismic protection does cost some money, and here's our best shot at what that amount is. The benefit study, as I think I mentioned, is a little bit softer. The tools aren't as robust or solid for that. But what we found was, in round numbers, if you ignore seismic in your codes completely, you're going to have 3 to 5 times as many building collapses in an earthquake. If you don't move forward, you keep the code that you currently have in Memphis and don't move forward with the code that you're going to use next year, you'll have twice as many building collapses, twice as many fatalities. You'll have higher repair costs. And one lesson to take from this is there's a lot of uncertainty in how big ground motions are. There's some uncertainty in how buildings do perform. And there is no absolute guarantee. There's no earthquake-proof code, no earthquake-proof building, but you're making your chance of success better when you go to your new code.
In codes, we don't say earthquake-proof, we say earthquake-resistant.
That's well said.
Yes.
Jay Stressel, MLG&W has invested heavily in seismic upgrades. Why? I think we know why, but we'll let you tell us why. And what justifies the increased cost?
Well, obviously, the MLG&W is the lifeline of this community. We recognized a long time ago, quite a few years ago, that, you know, of all the entities that we needed to be the most prepared, water, gas, electricity, we've spent probably going over $80 million now on seismic mitigation projects.
Move your microphone a little bit. Thank you.
And about $6 million of that was provided by FEMA. And I think that, from what I understand, we got another grant recently to anchor some of our network transformers downtown. A big chunk of this money went to all water plants. We retrofitted a lot of water plants, the piping, installed backup power, the retrofits to the pump buildings and the aerators. It was pretty extensive, but, you know, for fire reasons, for water needs, for extra power, you know, it's a redundancy for our power system to make sure we have a generator on site. Quite a bit went into that. And then we started looking at heavy transformers at our gate stations. They needed to be anchored. And a lot of this came from a study that actually was done by the structural firm, or actually the design firm that I work for, Allen & Hoschel. They did a preparedness study back in 1989. It was finished after I started, and a lot of those vulnerabilities were addressed, you know, from that study. And then since then, we've done multi-hazard risk assessment that just pretty much added a lot of other elements to it, but it pretty much reinforced what we already knew in a lot of ways, that seismic is going to control for a lot of our buildings. MLG&W has a lot of old buildings, a lot of old stock, and a lot of old systems, and it takes a lot of money, but over a long period of time, we can get this done and get most of it done. So, as Jim mentioned, we have that opportunity to make repairs on systems, but if you don't start somewhere, you'll never catch up.
So in the event of a major quake, we won't lose power, right?
I'm not going to
Come on,
guarantee
Jay.
that.
I'm sorry, I had to ask that.
I do know that whenever we lose power, it's very important to get it up as fast as possible. And we have criteria for that, but in an earthquake, I think all bets are off.
Bob, if I can add to that, that again goes back to what Dr. Berryman had said with the resiliency. If you don't have power and water, and this was demonstrated very well in Haiti, in the Haiti earthquake, they had 250,000 people were killed in the initial event, but an additional 250,000 people have since died because they didn't have the infrastructure back up and running to provide clean water and medical facilities. So the utility side of this almost, I would venture to say, more important than the structure side. If you can't provide a safe, clean living environment, it doesn't matter if you can live in your buildings, you're still going to be subject to health risks.
Make one more note that the utility, you said exactly right, that a lot of the retrofits were concentrated initially on the utility side, and that's where most of that $80 million was spent. And just recently, we started thinking about doing something to the buildings and trying to do some business continuity, but that had to come first.
That brings us back to Rem Brown again. IBHS has built homes all over the country through its Fortified for Safer Living program, a cost-plus standard that goes above code requirements. Can you give us an estimated increase in cost for building to this standard?
Now, those cost increases can vary depending on how well the building code is enforced in the area that we're building in, because if it's a really low enforcement code, it costs, it's closer to the 10% than the 5%, because we're above the code. So if you go from low code to above code, the cost is going to be different. Last year, we had the opportunity to partner with St. Jude and others on the 2012 Fortified St. Jude Dream Home that was built in the Memphis area. The hazards that we addressed there were obviously earthquake, but also high wind and hail. Those are the hazards that exist in this area. So we based the wind design on 110 mile per hour wind speed, which is 20 miles an hour above the code. And the seismic design was based on the ASC 710 seismic provisions with a 20% increase in the map ground acceleration. And then we have some just prescriptive requirements too that are would be non-structural, like tempered glass and for the windows, installation of flexible gas supply lines, and the installation of an automatic gas shutoff valve at the gas meter, and the water heater secured to the wall. So given all that, the cost increase that was submitted to us for all the fortified upgrades, which also, keep in mind, included high wind and hail, which was a pretty significant cost, because for hail we put an impact-resistant roof on, but all of those costs were about $23,000. And so it's not just seismic, and since it was a St. Jude home, it's really hard to sort of use percentages, because there's a lot of material and labor that was donated or discounted. But the value of the home was estimated at $425,000. And we didn't really get actual construction costs. So overall, we felt like it still fit within our 5 to 10% cost of construction.
Thank you. Julie Furr, what design levels do building codes require in life safety versus immediate occupancy?
Life safety, the terms are pretty much what they sound like. Life safety, the intent of the building is to stand up long enough for you to get out of it. It doesn't mean that you can go back and use it. It doesn't mean it's going to be safe to reoccupy. And it doesn't mean that it can be easily repaired and made livable again. It may have to come down. Most buildings are designed to life safety. Most, even large buildings, such as the theater that we're in, are going to be designed to that level. Immediate occupancy is a building that has to be functional. So our 911 call centers, our fire stations, our hospitals, emergency facilities, shelters, any shelters that are designated as a refuge, area of refuge in an event, are deemed immediate occupancy. And those are designed to a higher standard that does require the building to be usable. You might have some architectural damage, you might have a few lights come down, but overall the building's going to be safe to occupy.
Thank you. John Rush, do you see market advantages to separating your company from other builders if you built a higher standard than the adopted minimum code? You indicated that you usually exceed the code. Is that marketable?
It's very, very marketable. Thank you for the question. But the opportunity as a custom home builder to sit down with the potential homeowner of one of your homes is invaluable, because it allows you to have that conversation about the items that they simply don't know anything about. They're not home builders, they're not in the home building industry, they may be doctors, lawyers, whatever it may be. And they're experts in what they do when it comes to home building. There seems to be an idea that I have run across that all houses are the same because they're all built to code. Well, that's an interesting philosophy, but it seems to be that that's the mentality with somebody that just doesn't know the building process and what can be different. And when it comes to insulation, there's a bunch of different insulations, and they're not all the same. And just because it's got an R value doesn't mean that's its performance. And the opportunity to sit down and talk to someone about the differences and physically show them through the houses that I may currently have or a showroom that I have, it allows me to win them over to see the difference. And so marketability is a big deal, obviously, for any small business like mine is. And my motto on my website and everything is, there's a better way to build, and it's worth your time to know the difference. And if you know the difference, most of the time you will opt for whatever it may be. When it comes to seismic, it's the same thing. There's a level of expectation that everyone should have when they move into a home, that it's safe, not, I guess, earthquake proof, but at least give you the opportunity to survive. And within that, obviously, there's different steps, there's different levels. There's 20% better. Is that a good one? Maybe. I mean, that sounds pretty good. Or is code sufficient? Whatever it may be. But the idea, and I think it's very important to understand this from a builder standpoint, is I view code as a roadmap, not the end. And then I see what's needed, and then I see, well, what the intent? I'm not looking necessarily for direction, I'm looking for a map. What's the intent, how do I see that? And a lot of times I have to hire engineers to do that, okay? But that's what people expect, my clientele expects. In a speculative market where you're building a home where you will not have the opportunity to sit down with somebody, and you've got two other somewhat interested parties, being a banker and an appraiser, that don't know anything about the home, and to try to build that way against somebody who's building to a minimum of code, and then try to tell somebody that, no, this one's better than that one, as an example you gave, it's almost impossible. And I have found that I'm not very good at speculative building, so I don't do much of that.
Thank you.
Bob, if I could throw my 2 cents worth in. I would say the underlying driving force in the questions of whether or not we adopt building codes is money. How much do we spend? How much are the banks going to give you a value for what you put into the building, whether it's commercial or residential? And certainly all of us, you know, if we're buying a home, if that house is $10,000 more, we may not buy that home even though it's a safer home. And that's part of the public education, but not, in addition to the public, the financing community, the insurance community, the appraisal community, all of the individuals that John has mentioned and I've heard mentioned before by the builders also need to understand the value of seismic upgrades and building codes and start giving credit where credit's due. It's not done yet. They don't see the difference in the two designs, but that's also something that we need to work on as far as education.
Unfortunately, when the building inspector makes his final inspection and issues a certificate of occupancy, and the homeowner can now move in, or the commercial building, if you asked them, the homeowner, have you got a good house? Well, yeah, it's been inspected and approved. It's
Right.
good. Well, that means it meets the minimum standard. That doesn't mean that it exceeds the code. It just barely gets by. It's just a spec builder, a lot of times, in order to keep the value in his company, to keep being profitable, obviously, he's got to make a living. We'll try to find ways to drop everything down to the very minimum code. And your code enforcement departments, their job is to make sure he doesn't drop further below that. But that doesn't make it a great house. That makes it a okay house, a safe house.
Good.
I think, you know, that's true if you have a well-enforced and a good code to begin with. But if you don't start with a good code, you know, meeting that level doesn't, I mean, I think the homeowner's perception is that he's got a house that's safe, that's built to sort of these, maybe not, they don't think about it in terms of national standards, but certainly they think that you know, their house being built here in Memphis would be the same as anybody's being built in California or Minneapolis or wherever it is. But you have to start with a good code, right? You have to start with model codes to get to that point. So, you know, that's what I think most people think that they're getting a good house. But like I said, if you're meeting the minimum code of a very low level code, I'm not sure that provides the kind of it doesn't really address that question, that issue of safety. So.
The other side of that question is when communities fail to adopt modern codes, it affects their insurance rates. The Insurance Services Office's Building Code Effectiveness Grading Scale recently dropped Memphis and Shelby County from a 3, the lower your score, the better, the higher it is, from a 3 to an 8. So this will affect people's insurance rates in this area until the building codes are brought up to modern levels. The other aspect of it is that if you're not built to modern codes or to Codes Plus, then it affects the durability of your home, which decreases the value over time as well.
Well, having said that, Barbara, because of the risk of life safety, would you advocate for clearly identifying seismically upgraded buildings to the general public?
Wouldn't it be great if we had a Carfax for homes?
I'm sorry?
A Carfax for homes.
Carfax for homes.
So if you
We're gonna
walked
get a
into
little
your,
box and-
yeah, so if you walked into your home, right by your circuit breaker box would be a plate. And it would identify the year that home was built, the builder, the code that it was built to, whatever safety features were incorporated into that home. Knowledge is power. You know, we've seen that in the automobile industry. Nobody buys a used car anymore without checking the Carfax, right? So what if we had that for homes? It'd be terrific.
How are you going to get that data?
We're working on it.
I can see the problem right up.
I would like to add something to that. I've had the opportunity to chair the Green Committee for Memphis area for the West Tennessee Home Builders Association, and one of our challenges was how do I distinguish my home from the one down the street? I need a sticker on my door that gives the miles per gallon on my house so that they can see and make an objective comparison. There is a home energy rating system score called a Furr score that has gone a long way in levelizing that, an objective number to compare one house in relation to another house. And that would be great. And I don't know if it necessarily has to be mandated, but it could be market-driven to educate the people, what is the miles per gallon on my house?
What
if
if
they
you
can
also-
answer that, I'll guarantee you I can get into the spec home building business.
Yeah, what if it also said the wind shear that it would withstand, the earthquake shaking that it would withstand?
Exactly. It'd be like just like you're buying a car. When you go to the window of the car, you expect to see the list of things you're getting, and you'll know what you're not getting.
Right.
And I think that'd be a good way, neat way to go anyway.
David Johnston, how are code requirements perceived in New Zealand by both designers and developers?
Probably direct some of those questions to Kelvin because and I'll try and address them. Most of my work has been looking at how the public and communities have perceived risk, and the codes. So before the earthquake, there was, and the annual discussions with the earthquake engineering and the structural engineering, the profession, and discussions about that, and there was a buildings code standards committees, etc. But I think much of the conversation about building codes was absent from much of the public conversation prior to the first of the Christchurch or Canterbury earthquakes, and that radically changed, and that there's been much more public discussion about codes, what they mean, and that's been accompanied by quite a bit of misunderstanding about it, and there was the immediate response was a desire for strong buildings and asking questions of the profession. Why did what we saw in February in 2011 happen? I thought we had good world-class codes in New Zealand. So the perception has radically changed and the narrative around it. And I think there's a difficulty often in framing it when there is a variable risk across the country, and the Canterbury events were very rare and extreme events on the scale, as Kelvin has pointed out. So the story isn't clear, it's pretty complex and is ever changing as time and costs come, or time passes by and the true costs. So much of the public immediately after the earthquake were demanding, we want safe buildings, but what is safe and what do you have to spend to achieve that? So we are still working through changes to our building code, and we're still discussing as a country what this means, and I think it's similar to this discussion now. One of the things that we're seeing here is you are having this discussion before an event, and we had it partially before the event, but we're certainly having it after the event. So what you do now will make more difference than what you do after the event for the next event.
I've got a quick question, just came to my head immediately. What code is New Zealand actually under, or was it under prior to the quake?
Can I ask Kelvin to answer that one?
Is it based on one of the model codes similar to ICC codes?
I can add a little bit to that answer. He's exactly right.
Please.
From the structural engineering point of view, their code is similar. Not exactly the same. There are some differences in the styles of construction. There are a few differences in the philosophy of how the structure is designed. To no small extent, in fact, our codes emulate what has been done in New Zealand from a structural engineering point of view. Small country, but they have been leaders, at least in some significant concepts, in coming up with a way to keep a building standing when an event that is more demanding than anything else that you expect to occur to that building happens, and your objective is to at least get out of the building safely. Now, there is a discussion, I think, going on in the engineering community in New Zealand, and you know, should we be alive when the big event hits the New Madrid area? I think that discussion is going to happen here. The decision about how safe is safe enough has largely been contained within the technical engineering community. it has not been a true public discussion where costs and benefits are weighed in a broader fashion. To begin with, it's really difficult to come up with hard numbers on the benefits side. And what our objective under the new code you're going to be using here in Memphis is that the probability that a building would collapse due to an earthquake in areas where earthquakes are likely to be strong, and Memphis is such a place, is about 1% every 50 years, or 1/50% in a year. That sounds small at first, but it looks big if you compare it to what is the probability that the building will be blown over in a windstorm. It's about 10 times more likely that it'll fall down in an earthquake than be blown over in a windstorm, on the average, all right? Now, places where earthquakes don't matter, that's not true. But places where earthquakes really matter, that is true, and part of it's because it costs real money to provide earthquake resistance in buildings. It's a tough subject. I think it's not just the technical engineering community. I think it's the entire community of people advocating for improved resilience in their building stock are going to have tough questions to answer after a big earthquake in the United States.
When we first got into earthquake codes here in the Memphis area, obviously the code officials, me and the code official for the city of Memphis, who happens to be my business partner now, we were put under some bad light because we were adopting these new codes and causing all this additional cost, and we were the bad guys. Back then, the codes said that what we're trying to do is keep the house standing long enough to get the people out. Would one of the engineers like to, are we still just designing good enough to get the people out, or are we expecting the house to resist the quake?
I'll take a crack
Or
first,
survive the quake.
but I assume others will want to chime in on this also. That depends upon what earthquake happens, all right?
Naturally.
So if you take Christchurch as a learning example here, what happened in the first earthquake, which was a larger earthquake at a further distance away, was somewhat below, I think, their design earthquake in their code, but close. And the objective under that level of earthquake is that the economic impact is not overwhelming. You still are going to have damage, and there's going to be real money spent, but it doesn't shut things down. When the second, the smaller but much closer earthquake came, which meant that the ground motions under the buildings downtown were much, much larger, much more rare event, as Dr. Berryman has described. I think the objective there is that first one you said, for the ordinary building, get out alive. That's all. It may be a total loss afterwards. The shelter-in-place concept sounds nice, but it depends upon, is it the really big earthquake, or is it the moderately big earthquake, or is it the every 10-year earthquake? And the shelter-in-place is something we are not achieving for the really big earthquake.
I saw you fidgeting over there, Julia.
Yes. They're building codes, it's easy to say that they're built for life safety. And with gravity loads, it's very easy to say a floor weighs X amount of pounds. So you can actually design your columns, you can design your walls, beams, and everything that support it for a discrete number. With earthquakes, first of all, as Jim has mentioned and Dr. Berryman has mentioned, you have to pick an earthquake. You have to pick an event. If that magnitude 6 event is right under your city, it's going to cause a lot more damage than if that magnitude 6 event is 50 miles away. And how do you define that? We can't predict earthquakes. We don't know when or where. We can only give you a general idea and a general concept of the magnitude. So you have to pick a design event, and in Christchurch, what they experienced is their design event was actually exceeded. Their building code was written around that event. It was not written around what they actually experienced. So that's one thing with the building codes, you have to find that cutoff point. We could theoretically design for anything that we could imagine, but that would be cost prohibitive and nothing would ever get built by codes at all. The other question that people dance around a lot and is typically discussed behind closed doors is the concept of an acceptable loss. we've been talking buildings and we've been talking structure, but you also have to look at this in terms of life safety. What's acceptable? Do you design every single building to stand up under your design event? Well, now you're back to the economics. You can't afford to do that. So how do you define an acceptable loss? And I don't think anybody's ever really been able to answer that question.
This question's for Jay Stressel. Obviously, Light, Gas, and Water cares about earthquakes. They're invested money to help survive one. What's your thoughts on the community as a whole? Should they care about earthquakes and the earthquake risk in building codes?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, getting people educated on this is huge. They should be concerned about their, you know, like MLG&W, what are we doing to safeguard ourselves, our assets, to be there for them. They need to be concerned about where they're going to go after an earthquake if they don't have a place to live. There's a lot of different things that they should be concerned about. Now, getting them to understand that is a challenge. You know, MLG&W, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. You know, we've invested a little bit in our buildings and our infrastructure, as well as our utility side, because we identified that we had business continuity issues, and it was very important not only for the utility side to be prepared, but also to have people come in to work, to be actually, you know, get contracts in place, to you know, get people out on the job. And there's a lot of infrastructure behind the scenes that needs to be there. And just like in Memphis, as a whole, has a lot of elements that need to be there ready to, you know, to take over when they need them. To touch a little bit on what was said before, it kind of went perfect with what I had to say about the level of earthquake, life safety versus immediate occupancy. We identified, as well as the utility side, but on the building side, to go with a performance-based design. Basically what that is that we choose the earthquake we want to design to. And that was a more moderate earthquake. And we choose also the performance that earthquake has to be designed for. So we choose immediate occupancy for any new buildings. But then at the same time, that structural engineer can look at the building for collapse prevention under the most credible earthquake, which is the big one. So, you know, our goal is to be up and going in certain buildings and newer buildings. And we did have we bought a building back in 2003. It's about 94,000 square feet. We did retrofit it to that standard. So we will have computer systems in place, call centers in place to be able to respond to the public when they need us. And that's why they need to be concerned about the codes, not just for life safety, but also for their areas that they're going to need to access, and they need to be up and running after an earthquake. They don't need to be down. Can you imagine we've got 3,000 employees, and we got about 200 buildings, roughly, some small, some big, but if we can't access half of them, how are we going to do business? So it's a big deal. The other thing, too, is non-structural elements. We hadn't really discussed that here, but MLG&W has a lot of non-structural elements. That's all your electric, gas systems, water systems, not just buildings. When we looked at all of our buildings, we identified all those pieces that need to be anchored. The cheapest way to be prepared for an earthquake is to anchor your non-structural elements in your building, your transformers, your boilers, your air handlers, all those things that could put you down in business. A simple thing as a sprinkler system in a building could totally wipe you out if you flood the whole building. People don't think about that stuff. I've heard this number before, that for an earthquake that may not necessarily damage your building, if you had damage to your non-structural elements, it's about 50% of the total loss of a building. Or more. So, you know, it's significant. You talk about 4 bolts on a transformer, or it's cheap. Benefit cost is like astronomical difference. So if you want to prepare now for anything, that's where you should focus.
You mentioned trying to get your people to work after a reasonably strong quake. Do you think the roads and bridges that the mayor mentioned will be allowing you to get your employees to work? or once they get to work, to be able to take their trucks and get out and service the community?
Well, that's a big concern, and I'm not the one to answer that as much as maybe Callan Hayes out there. He's done a lot more studying about this. I do know a lot of bridges were retrofitted. Again, it depends on the earthquake, how close it is. I do know that we have a lot of resources available to us, and as far as MLG&W is concerned, we're going to be out there, you know, working to get all that taken care of. But it's comforting to know that we're somewhat on the forefront in trying to retrofit all of our things now. Hopefully this won't happen for another 50, 100 years, and we'll have a whole lot more done by then.
Okay, we're running out of time. We didn't get to half the questions that were sent in, but we've got some good answers from the panelists. Would anybody in the audience care to ask a question of one of the panelists? Yes, sir.
First, I'd like to say this has been an excellent discussion. I hope it's being recorded and transcribed because, I mean, excellent panel. I hope it's kept for future use.
Can you address that? Oh, okay. Jim, is it being recorded? Will it be available to the public or through QSAC? Huh? Okay. Anyone else? Go ahead.
The biggest issue that I see is partly addressed because we have insurance people here, but both the banking and the insurance community could be holding the bag, literally, because they don't keep developers' feet to the fire when they make a structure. And I think that there could be a good alliance there, just not only for seismic, but for a variety of issues, if the banking and insurance industry would say there's some minimum standards, or we won't write the policy, or we won't write the mortgage.
Well, there's actually an insurance grading program that was started back before I retired, where they would come and grade the code enforcement department to see if they are reviewing plans correctly, see if they've got certified staff. And you got points for everything you were doing right, and obviously taken away for things that weren't right. And in the end, your department was proving how good it was. I was proud of it. I was looking forward to it. A lot of building officials fought it. They didn't want them coming in grading their department. So to me, I was thinking this is a great idea. It's still out there, but I don't think it ever caught on like they hoped it would.
I will offer just a personal observation. My husband and I just bought a house, and in setting up the homeowner's insurance, one of the questions was, do you know if this house has been seismically retrofitted? It's the first time I've ever had an insurance company ask that question, but the word is getting out there, at least through the insurance industry. If the banking industry would take notice also, I think that would go a long way to giving the builders and contractors and developers the ability to actually incorporate seismic upgrades and not have to take such a financial hit themselves.
I would add to that, I would welcome some type of certification from an insurance board, whether it's the Institute for Business and Home Safety. If there's a certification that would be standardized, and if a builder or a homeowner would do those things, that there would be a certification that would go with it, that would then allow for some type of economic incentive for the end user. I would welcome that. I think most builders would get on board with that.
I agree with you. The public will drive whatever we do.
Yes, absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're through. Please give the panelists a big hand. Thank you.